So today I'm going to be walking through how to make this fully reversible bodice. I've tried to keep everything as beginner friendly as possible, and I've made the pattern available on my Etsy, which is linked down below.
So for this project, you're going to need 2 colours or patterns of a woven fabric. I'm using cotton poplin for this one, which is probably the kind of fabric that I would most recommend, or polycotton I sometimes use, normally works really well. And then this is a cotton flannel, which is a slightly different composition, but I'm hoping they will still work well together. But I would normally recommend going for the same composition for each side of your bodice. It just needs to be a woven fabric with no stretch. I'm also going to be using pins, some fabric scissors to cut out my pieces, some fabric pens to draw out my pieces. I'm going to be using some eyelets and an eyelet tool. This is the one that I like to use, but you can use whichever is your favourite. I'm going to be using some fusible interfacing. I'm using medium weight, which is the weight that I would recommend, and you're also going to need an iron. In terms of my sewing machines, I'm going to be using a regular sewing machine for the whole project, just with a straight stitch. The pattern that I'm going to be using for this project is my Betty bodice, which just has 3 pattern pieces. So the first pattern piece is pattern piece 1, and I'm going to need 2 of these in each fabric in opposite orientations like that, and then 2 in my second fabric. I will show you that in a second. We also have pattern piece 2, which is the side front, and that's going to be exactly the same. I'm going to need 2 in each fabric in opposite orientations like this, and then 2 in my second fabric. And then pattern piece 3 is the back of my bodice, and this one I'm going to line it up to a fold and cut just 1 out for each fabric. So this means that when I cut it out and open up that fold, I'll have a double piece of this. But I'll show you how I'm going to lay everything out now. So I'm going to start with my pink piece of my fabric. So the first thing that you want to do is fold your fabric in half with the selvage edges, which is the bound edge, rather than an edge like this which will fray. This has been bound so that it doesn't. You want the 2 selvage edges to be on top of each other, so you want to fold it in that direction. Let me just show you a selvage edge a bit closer up. So this is how the selvage edge looks. You can see the top here is bound so that it doesn't fray, and then this would be an example of an edge that doesn't have a selvage edge. So you want to fold these 2 selvage edges on top of each other. So I've got my selvage edges here, and I've got a fold on this end. So now I'm going to take my pattern pieces. I'm going to start with pattern piece 1. So you should be able to see on pattern piece 1 there is an arrow that tells you it should go with the grain line, which basically means it just needs to be parallel to this selvage edge. If you want to be very precise about this, you can measure each edge of that arrow. So if I take my tape measure, if you wanted to be even more precise, you would extend this arrow the whole length of the piece. So this end of the arrow is 8.5 centimeters away from the edge, and so is this one. So it's absolutely fine where it is there. And then you want to do exactly the same for pattern piece 2, which is your side front. Again, you want to try and make this arrow parallel to that selvage edge. Just check that again. So that is just over 24, about 24.5. and about 24.5, so that's fine where it is. And the final piece is pattern piece 3, which just needs to be lined up to that fold. So now I'm just going to go in and draw all those pieces in place. So now that I've got those pieces drawn in place, I'm just going to take my pins and pin within those lines just to get the 2 layers, so that when I start to cut it out, they're going to be as accurate to be in the same shape and size as possible. So I'm just going to carry on putting these pins within the lines of my pieces for all 3, and then I'm going to carefully cut them out, just trying to make sure that I get 2 identical pieces. So I've just finished getting all of my pieces cut out and removed the pins. So you can see I've got 2 for pattern piece 1, which is the front of the bodice, and I have 1 for each side of the bodice. I have 2 for pattern piece 2, which is the front side of the bodice, and again I have 1 for each side. And then finally I just have 1 for pattern piece 3, which is the back of the bodice, but I can fold that out for one bigger piece, I am going to iron that crease out as well. So now I'm going to start to add my interfacing. So I've just got a piece of my interfacing here, which has got the glue facing up, which is the shiny side. I'm going to start to place my pieces on here. One thing that you have to be really conscious of is making sure that you keep one piece for each side. So I could very easily place both of these pieces onto the interfacing in this direction, which would mean that I don't have one for each side, I have two for one side. So if you aren't sure, I would just lay them out in this kind of orientation. You will end up probably wasting a little bit of interfacing, but at least you know that you're making one for each side. So I tend to lay them out like this and then find the best way to kind of save on my interfacing. So this is how I've decided to lay all my pieces out. As you can see with pattern piece 2, again, I've just got one for each side. I'm going to go in with my iron now and just run over the top of these to make sure that they stick to the interfacing. I would recommend taking your time with this because if you don't put enough heat on them, they can come undone. So I'm just going to really take my time, go over each one with an iron, and then I am going to cut them out. So just carefully cutting around the edge of that original shape, and then I'll show you how it all looks after that. A tip for ironing them on without having your iron stick to the glue as well is to use baking paper or greaseproof paper and just lay that onto where you are going to iron, and then you'll just be able to peel the greaseproof paper off the interfacing and just peel it off like that. That saves you having to be really careful around the edges or getting glue on your iron. So I've got all of my pieces with my interfacing attached now. So I've got my two pieces for my front, I've got the interfacing on the back, I've got my two pieces for my side, and again they've got interfacing on the back, and then I've got my back piece with the interfacing on the back. And now I'm just going to go in and repeat all of those steps for my second fabric until I have two lots that look like this. So now that I've got all of my pieces in both of my fabrics and I've added the interfacing to the back of all of these as well, I can start to move on to my construction. But before I do, I'm just going to add a eyelet guide to the front pieces. Just put these pieces to one side for now, and I'm going to grab my pattern and also my two pieces for the front. You only need to do this on one of your fabrics. It actually makes it a bit more confusing if you do it on both. So I'm just going to do it on my plain pink because it will be easier to see. So you'll see there is a guide down the front of this pattern that shows you where these eyelets should go. And I just like to punch one of these tools through the hole so that you can put a pen mark through it. So I'll start with this side. I just want to follow along that guide and leave a mark for each of those holes. And then I'm just going to flip the pattern and do it again for this side. And once they're in place, I'm just going to put this to one side and grab one of my pieces for pattern piece 2. So you want to grab the piece that is going to be for the same side. So I've just got these two here. I want this to be the one that is going to sit on the same side. So these are going to attach like that. So now I'm just going to take these with right sides facing together. So your goal here is to try and pin this curved edge here along this curved edge here. And obviously they are curves that go in opposite directions. So it can be a little bit tricky. You have to kind of manipulate the fabric a little bit. I normally like to start by doing the ends like this at either side. And then just fill in the space in between. Like I said, you will have to kind of manipulate the fabric around to get it to fit. And you do want to use a lot of pins for this. I'm probably going to get mine roughly in place and then I'll go in with more pins afterwards. So I'm going to go in now and sew a straight stitch with a 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way up this curve. I would recommend going really, really slowly to do this to make sure that you keep the right shape. I'm actually just going to walk through this on my machine just so that you can see me doing it. I'm just going to remove that first pin and then line this up at about 1 centimetre, which tends to be about the end of my foot. And then I've got my machine set to a straight stitch. I'm just going to follow that along. I'm going to start by reversing back over that to secure the stitch and then continuing. Just take out the next pin, just moving the fabric around to make sure it lines up. And then taking out the next pin. It's this kind of area that is the trickiest, so you want to take your most time here. And then the next one. So you just want to keep moving that fabric around to make sure everything's sitting in the right place. And take out that next pin. And then this section here should be a bit easier. And then once I get to that end, I'm just going to reverse again, just to secure that stitch. And then I always like to go in and check this curved section to just check that I've not got any folds or any creases, because in that case you can just unpick them and do them again. It looks absolutely fine. So that's how that should look once it's sewn in place. Just give you a closer look. It just looks something like that, and then you can open it out and it will look like this. So I'm just gonna turn it back over and I'm gonna press this seam open with my iron. It will be a little bit tricky to do because obviously it's curved, and then take my iron and press it like that. So that's how that looks once it's pressed open. It won't look perfect, and that is absolutely fine. And I've also gone in and repeated all of those same steps for my remaining pieces in pattern 1 and pattern 2. So now I'm just going to turn this to the right side and I'm going to grab the same piece in my other fabric. I'm just going to lay them right sides facing together. And I'm just going to start to pin these together. So I'm going to pin around the neckline, along this front edge, which is where the eyelets are going to be, along the bottom edge and around the armhole. So I'm just going to be leaving open the side seam and the top of the strap. So that's roughly how your piece should look once you've pinned all your edges in place. So I'm going to go in with a 1 centimetre seam allowance and a straight stitch and just sew around those edges, remembering to leave the top of the strap and the side seam open. So now that I've got those seams in place, I'm just going to go in with my scissors and cut some triangles around the curved edges and also the corners. So the curved edges would be the neckline and the armhole. You can do the bottom section if you want. You don't 100% need to, but I think I probably will. And then the corners are these areas here. And this is just going to help to improve the fit, especially of those curved edges. So I'm just going to carry on doing this, just all around this neckline and around the armhole. And I'm also going to do that bottom edge. The only edge that I'm not going to do that I just sewed is this front section here. So that's how this looks with all the triangles cut in. Like I said about this edge, this is completely optional. You can definitely leave this out. I was just on autopilot, and then I've got my corners cut in here as well. So then I want to turn this to the right side out and press it to make sure that it sits nice and flat, which looks something like this. I'm going to repeat that for this piece so that I have two pieces that look like this, and then I can put these to one side for the time being. So now I'm going to move on to making the back panel. So I'm going to take both my pieces and lay them right sides facing together. And now I'm just going to pin them together around this section here, around the armholes and around this bottom edge. Just going to leave the sides open and the top of the straps. So now that those edges are pinned in place, I'm just going to go in with a straight stitch, 1 centimetre seam allowance, and just sew around that armhole and the armhole on the other side, around the back of the neckline, and then just along that bottom edge, leaving open the sides and the top of the straps. So this is how that should look once you've sewn those 4 seams in place. So now I'm going to go in with some scissors and I'm just going to cut some small triangles, being very careful to stay away from that stitch line. Just going to cut these along my curved edges, so along the armholes and along that neckline. You don't need to do it on that bottom edge because it's straight. This is just going to help the curved edges to fit your body a bit better. I'm just going to carry on doing that until both the armholes are done and the back of the neckline. So once those triangles are all in place, I can move on to adding the front pieces to this piece. So I've got my piece for my back and I've got my 2 pieces for the front, which these should be the right way out and this wants to stay inside out. So I'm going to start with this piece. And with the right fabrics facing each other, so I've got this plaid fabric facing the plaid fabric and the pink facing the pink here, I'm just going to put this inside the back piece. You will likely have to fold it around a bit to get it to fit, and then I'm just going to match this strap into the strap of the back piece. And then I'm just going to pin along that straight edge. So I'm essentially pinning the strap of the front piece inside the strap of the back piece. And again, just making sure the corresponding fabrics are facing each other. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing with this side piece. So just matching that side inside the back piece. And again, just pin that in place. So now that I've got those 2 edges sewn in place, I've got 2 options. I can either add my second piece at the same time, or probably the easiest thing is to go in now and sew these 2 edges just before this starts to get quite bulky with all of the pieces inside of it. So you just want to sew along both of these edges with a straight stitch and 1 centimetre seam allowance. You also want to connect up the seam that you've got here on the armhole and just sew it straight down and then sew straight across this strap. I'm actually going to add my second piece in before I sew them in place. So if you do want to do that, just because it's a bit quicker, I'm just going to fold the first piece out the way. As you can see, it does start to get quite bulky. And then again, I'm going to fold this piece inside here. Again, making sure that you've got corresponding fabrics facing each other. This bit is probably the most awkward of the whole pattern, but once you've finished this, you've nearly finished the whole thing. So I've got my strap in place there. Just pin that along the top. And then do the same thing for this side seam. And this is where it starts to get a little bit awkward. So now that I've got both of my pieces pinned inside here, I'm just going to sew down each of those edges with a 1 centimetre seam allowance and a straight stitch. And just remember to match up your seams to the armholes. So just come in straight down from that seam. So once all of those seams are in place, we need to turn this to the right side out. So to do that, I'm going to unpick a small section along this bottom seam. I would recommend reinforcing the stitch line at either side of where your hole is going to be before you do this, just to make sure the whole thing doesn't come undone, but I'm just going to go in and do it anyway. So I'm just going to slowly start to unpick some of this section. It shouldn't be too difficult to do since it's just a straight stitch. So now that I've unpicked that hole to be about as big as I think it needs to be, I'm just going to very gently turn this to the right side out. You just want to check all of those seams that you've just sewed to make sure there aren't any holes or anywhere that you've missed one of the layers, because obviously you will be sewing through 4 layers of fabric. And then once you've done that, you can work towards sewing up this hole. So you have 2 options for this. You can either use a ladder stitch by hand and then just leave this as it is, or you can go in with a top stitch, which is what I'm going to do. And then while I'm doing the top stitch, I'm just going to fold this in on itself and sew straight over the top of it. If you want, you can do a ladder stitch before you add the top stitch, just to make this bit a little bit easier. And then in terms of everywhere else, I'm going to add the top stitch. I'm going to come straight along this bottom edge, obviously folding this hole in on itself. I'm not going to do any along these edges here because that's where the eyelets are going to go. I am going to come straight around these armholes and then straight along the neckline and around the back of the neckline. So straight along here and then around both armholes and along this bottom edge. So I'm just going to be sewing as close to that edge as I can with my straight stitch. So I'm just going to show you an example of how I'm going to do this top stitch along this bottom edge. So I've got my machine set to a straight stitch and I'm just going to follow close along that bottom edge. Just going to reverse at the start just to make sure that that is secure. I'm just coming up to this hole now, so I'm just going to start to fold it in on itself. I'm just going to follow along that hole nice and slowly. And then when I get to the other side, I'm just going to reverse here again. And then I'm going to repeat that for the armholes and the neckline. So I've just finished adding that top stitch in, and now the only thing left to do is to add my eyelets. So this is the kit that I'm going to be using, which is from Hemline. I do really like this kit. I use it a lot. I'm not going to do this on camera just because it's very, very noisy because it requires the use of a hammer. So I normally do it on the kitchen floor. But basically you just use these 2 areas here and hammer them in, firstly to make the holes and then to add your actual eyelets. There are tutorials online if you're not sure how to use it, but obviously for this part you just want to use whichever kit that you have and follow the instructions, and then I will be back when I have added my eyelets. So that's how it looks with the eyelets added. Just ignore how wonky it is on this side. Genuinely probably could have done a better job with my eyes closed. And then the bodice is finished.